Ladies and gentlemen, could we settle down for the main point, or the high point of the evening, should we say? If we could just take our seats. Right, I just want to explain, we're sitting down because there's people who've joined us on Zoom can see us. I'm on camera here, and I'm afraid Professor Hussein Solomon's going to have to do the same because so that the Zoom people can see what's going on and hear us. I mean, it's not usual, but this is how we've got to operate at the moment. Thank you. So now, ladies and gentlemen, members, guests, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome our dear friend Hussein Solomon, Professor Solomon, who has agreed to come and address us. We're really grateful that you've come to this historic occasion when it's our first real meeting for 9 months. And you're going to address us on the crisis of democratization in the Middle East North African region, and that is going to be extremely interesting. Now, Professor Hussein Solomon has a very long and glittering CV. I'll just give you a few extracts from it. He holds a D.Lit and a doctorate of literature and political science from the University of South Africa. Currently, he is senior professor and academic head of department in the Department of Political Studies and Governance at the University of the Free State. He's had many previous appointments. For instance, he was professor and director of the Center for International Political Studies at the University of Pretoria between 2000 and 2010. He's lectured all over the world. Just to give one or two examples, in 2007 and 10, he was visiting professor at the Global Collaboration Center at Osaka University of Japan. In 2008, he was Nelson Mandela Chair of African Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, as a couple of examples. He's also been a research associate of the South African Institute of International Affairs, and he's on many advisory boards and editorial boards in Africa and Europe. Amazingly, he also holds the rank of captain in the reserve force of the South African Air Force. He has many publications. They've appeared all over the world, and I could just give you a couple of examples of his most recent books, which includes Arab MENA countries, vulnerability and constraints against democracy on the eve of the global COVID-19 crisis, and exporting global jihad. These are with other authors together. He's a member of many academic academies and associations. It's a very long CV, but I've given you a couple of highlights. And it's now my pleasure to hand over to Professor Hussein Solomon for his address, which means I have to give you this, and you have to come here. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Sheila, for the kind words. I should also thank you, Martha Bridgman and Pepper Siegel, for the invitation here. I've been a long, and I would argue maybe active associate of SAIA, being active in SAIA branches when I was still in Gauteng and in KZN, having published in SAIA publications, having served as a Bradlow Fellow, and have spoken at various SAIA platforms. So I'm actually pleased to make a presentation and to renew my relationship with SAIA. I would like to maybe thank a special member in the audience, and that's Dr. Leonard Sorensky sitting over there, because he was the one who wanted to actually be an anthropologist, and he saved me from Khoisan cave paintings and such stuff, and introduced me to the Middle East and to Israel Palestine. So it's kind of sort of a full circle having him in the audience here. So as we all know, there are tectonic shifts taking place across the MENA region. And we're not talking about the Abrahamic Accords and what's happening with the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan and so forth. I think that while the news focuses on those developments, there are tectonic changes taking place amongst ordinary people when you look at the assertive women's movements across countries, when you look at Algerian Muslims not wanting to fast in Ramadan, when you look at growing secular values in Turkey and Iran. What I want to talk about today in terms of the issue of democratization, I want to speak actually to my book, which came out earlier this year with Springer, which I did with Arno Tosh. And it essentially focuses on two issues: values change and what that means, and also the issue of Islamism linked to that, and religiosity and what that means for democratization. And I also want to speak about what this means for the future of Islam, and whether or not it's compatible with issues of democratization. In this book that we did, we focus on the World Values Survey. Now the question might well be, why focus on the World Values Survey? Well, it covers 72 countries of the world, 4/5 of the globe's population. But we also draw upon other surveys, such as those conducted by the BBC Arabic, Pew, and so forth. And while these trends in terms of statistical trends in terms of democratization, there are also various case studies focusing on countries as diverse as Egypt and Sudan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, Iran, of course. And there are thematic issues focusing on issues of Sharia, Islamic law, the Hadith, and of course, political democratization and economic growth. And so I should also maybe say that, and I would like to maybe thank the South African Military Academy, because they hosted me while I was on sabbatical last year in Saldanha. And it gave me the space to actually focus in terms of this book. My tone in terms of examining prospects of democratization in the MENA region is one of cautious optimism. I say cautious because 10% of the population in countries as like Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon still support Hamas and Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. 50% or more of the population in the West Bank and Gaza, Iran, Morocco support Sharia law. Another 50% support the death penalty for those who leave the Muslim faith in those countries. A third of the population in Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, West Bank, and Gaza support the idea that one should kill a female offender who besmirches the family's honor, and so forth. And across the region, there's a distrust of public institutions, such as the police and the courts. Of course, the percentage varies between countries. And all this suggests the need for caution when discussing issues of democratization. And here, when I talk about democratization, I'm not simply talking about open elections and the like, but also the underlying cultural ethos needed to sustain democratic polities. But there is optimism, because I think that the long-term prognosis, specifically for Islamist parties, do not look good because of the values change taking place across the Arab world, and especially amongst the youth. And this is as a result of processes of urbanization, modernization, globalization, all facilitated by modern technology. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there are tremendous trends of a more secular Middle East, a more liberal Middle East, a more egalitarian Middle East, as people move away from conservative religion and tradition, as well as ethnocentrism. I think in the process, you have Arab societies getting more tolerant of the proverbial other. Non-Muslims, Americans, other Westerners, and Jews. You know, when you look at the building of Jewish synagogues in Egypt and Lebanon and these particular countries. And when you look at the relationship between Muslim religiosity and democratic support, it does not necessarily need to be negative, okay? Religiously observant Muslims constitute those who espouse a more orthodox view, attempting to create a social order on divine laws, as well as those who are more modernist in orientation and subscribe to religious pluralism. Whereas groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, support a more orthodox perspective, recent data suggests that more Muslims in the region, especially amongst the younger generation, are adopting a more modernist orientation to faith. The Arab Youth Survey of 2019 amongst youth aged between 18 to 24 in the region suggests that the region is becoming more secular in their attitudes. These youth blame religion and sectarianism for the region's various conflicts, and 66% of the youth surveyed believe that religion is playing too large a role in the Middle East, while half agree that the Arab world's religious values are holding the Arab world back. So Muhammad Sharur of the University of Damascus, and I'm going to quote him, said that the region were confronted with a deep intellectual dilemma when it came to reconciling conservative teachings with the world they inhabit. So, and various polls also proved this in terms of the BB News Arabic, which showed that the political support for groups like your Muslim Brotherhood is actually on the wane. Results from Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Libya, Morocco, the West Bank, Gaza, Tunisia, Sudan, Yemen, all of them show that trust, for example, in the Muslim Brotherhood decreased by 20% between 2012, 2013, and now in Sudan, it decreased by 25% from 49% to 24%. And even support for the reformist Ennahda in Tunisia has declined by 24%, whilst Palestinian support for Hamas had declined to 22% from 48% over this 2012-2019 period. I want to specifically talk about two countries controlled by Islamists, and that is Iran and Turkey. Now, the Islamic Republic of Iran claims that 99.5% of the population are Muslim. But recent surveys published in The Conversation found that only 40% of Iranians identify themselves as Muslim. I'm not even talking about the Shia-Sunni divide. 78% of Iranians believe in God, but only 37% believe in life after death, and only 30% believe in a heaven and a hell. And around 20% said they did not believe in God. This is Iran that we're talking about. We're not talking about the UAE. If you turn to Turkey, a Pew survey found that only 12% of Muslims in Turkey desire Sharia law to be the official law in the country. A 2019 poll of Turkish youth found that they were less likely to be religiously conservative, less likely to fast during the holy month of Ramadan, pray, or if female, cover their hair. And a 2020 poll found that only 12% of Turks trust Islamic clerics. What this suggests is that both Turkish President Erdogan and the Ayatollahs in Iran are out of step with their own population. Now, what is also interesting about the different surveys is that you find that Muslims also, those Muslims who desire more Islam in their public space, also want more democracy in their polities. And this is by surveys from both the World Value Survey and Pew. So in other words, these Muslims want both Islam and greater political freedom in their lives. And they see no contradiction between being both Muslim and being democratic. So the challenge then is to indigenize both democracy and secularism within the Muslim world and not to view it through a Eurocentric lens. In marrying the universal norms of democracy within the particular socio-cultural context that Islamic societies find themselves in, I was specifically drawn to the words of Sudipta Kaviraj. And she said this, and I'm quoting her, the process of modernity are universal, but these processes are realized through a trajectory of historic events which are specific to each society. So in attempting to indigenize Islamic democracy, I want to quote the democratic theorist T.F. Rodin, and I'm quoting him here. He says, in case of any confusion, liberal democracy does not mean American democracy. Okay, the liberal in liberal democracy must be stripped of any preconceived ethnocentric notions if it is to have any analytical power in a more inclusive political science. Liberalism need not be confused with something only viable for the English-speaking world, your Western Europe, your Japan. It is quite okay to reject America's penchant for firearms, her lack of universal health care, or her environmental policies, and still keep basic liberal tenets like individual liberties, habeas corpus, or institutions of government other than the executive. So I want to maybe spend a few words on how an Islamic democracy, given what I just said, might come about in reality. Let's be frank first. The Western notion of separation between religion and the political sphere hardly exists in reality. Okay? Jürgen Habermas has pointed out that ideas of freedom, democracy, and human rights emanate from the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love, after all. Research undertaken by Jonathan Fox also proves that the so-called separation between religion and state hardly exists. Fox's survey of 152 countries proved that a full separation of religion and state only exists in one country. According to him, that was the United States. And I find it hard to believe, especially in terms of the Trump years. Okay, so how can faith and democracy peacefully coexist? Okay, so I turn to the work of Stepan and Linz, who proposed that what was needed was a significant degree of differentiation between religion and state. This situation of differentiation, as opposed to a hard wall, for example, in terms of the French model, is summed up, according to them, as the twin tolerations. And in a country that lives by these twin tolerations, religious authorities do not control democratic officials who are acting constitutionally, while democratic officials do not control religious actors as long as these respect other citizens' rights. So many patterns of relations between the state and faith and society can actually coexist. So in other words, there are multiple secularisms. Now, let's turn to the Muslim world. If you go back to the 1990s, you had, for example, in 1998, 50 Turkish intellectuals coming together from different ideological persuasions and believe that one can still hold on to the notion of God's sovereignty and still the notion that in a democracy, the people are sovereign. This position stands in sharp contrast to the Islamist position of an all-encompassing divine sovereignty reflected in the Islamist phrase din wal dola, that Islam is both religion and state. In the 1990s, some of the most innovative thought actually comes out of Iran. The new religious thinkers in Iran question the ruling clerical establishment, asserting the right of individuals to make their own moral judgments on the basis of reason and their own individual conscience. Okay, now this is an important point, because if you're looking at the future of freedom and democracy in the MENA region, the state was often negatively conceived. The state was conceived more in the way of St. Augustine's city of God, as opposed to the ancient Greek position of politics. In other words, the state existed to keep us from our negative impulses, okay? And this was then moved into the political sphere. So you have innovative Islamic scholars have also explained that Sharia is not a monolithic Islamic system. It's not. So rather you have fiqh, which is focusing on personal morality, and siyasa, which focuses on rulers serving the public good. Importantly, siyasa does not have its origins in Islamic scripture, but rather from good governance principles, more generally with an emphasis on the public good, or what's called maslaha amma. Now, here's the really interesting thing. Sherazad Rahman and Hussein Askari developed something called an Islamicity Index. And they looked at 113 Quranic injunctions pertaining to the public good, and they correlated this with the data sets freely available from the UN Human Development Index, the World Bank, and other sources. According to this Islamicity Index, the top 10 most Islamic countries in the world, let me repeat this. The top 10 most Islamic countries in the world are Ireland, Denmark, Luxembourg, Sweden, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Finland, and Norway. Muslim majority countries, by contrast, did poorly on this Islamicity Index in terms of providing for the public good. Saudi Arabia secured the 91st position, Qatar 112, Morocco 120, Egypt 129, Iran 139, and Sudan 190. Okay. Let me now briefly turn towards post-Islamism and civil Islam. Bernard Lewis, that doyen of Middle East studies, put forth an argument that has often been regarded as part of the establishment in terms of Middle East studies, that Islam cannot be democratized, that Muslims and Arabs cannot view themselves as independent from the divine. Such a perspective, however, ignores the skepticism, rationalism, and humanism in Arab history, as Phil Zuckerman alludes to in his work. Zuckerman quotes numerous Arab scholars who reflected on this tradition. There was the 9th century skeptic Ibn al-Rawandi, who negated Islam as he advocated free thought. Also in the 9th century, there was the critical rationalism of Muhammad al-Warraq, who doubted the existence of a God and the veracity of divine revelation. You had Muhammad al-Razi, who advanced the study of the natural sciences and questioned the divinity of the Quran. Then there was the secular humanism of Omar Khayyam of the 11th century, and the 12th century towering intellect of the founding father of secular philosophy, Averroes. So it's not true that this doesn't exist. And we mustn't look at things trapped in terms of present day events. So tapping into the secular humanist and critical rationalist tradition, Muslim scholars are increasingly examining a post-Islamist future. Asef Bayat describes a present where Islamism increasingly loses legitimacy on account of their system's contradictions and failures. A classic example was the Muslim Brotherhood under Muhammad Morsi, when they were, 1 year in power in Egypt, and things were not working exactly smoothly. Um, Compelled by a combination of these anomalies and societal pressure, many of these Islamist parties have to reinvent themselves. This reinvention is revolutionary in that it entails a qualitative shift in their ideological position. Whilst Islamism is characterized by universalism, exclusivism, obligation, and a monopoly of religious truth, post-Islamist movements stress ambiguity and multiplicity, inclusion and compromise in principles and practice and responsibility. It is important to acknowledge that this post-Islamism does not represent the jettisoning of religion in the public sphere. Rather, post-Islamism refers to an inclusive religiosity, one which is compatible to liberal democratic norms. You have Ali Etaraz, who notes that post-Islamism recognizes that politics, rather than religion, provides for the welfare in this life. These changes already started appearing in the mid-1990s when you had the Al-Wasat Party in Egypt, which was formed as an alternative to both militant Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood. Whilst Wasat regarded itself as an Islamic party, it welcomed secularists and Coptic Christians into its fold. It also rejected religious and gender discrimination, and it was opposed to an extra-constitutional body of clerics as in Iran, which can veto laws and support the separation of powers. Tunisia's Islamists, in the form of Ennahda, has increasingly distanced itself from its Muslim Brotherhood origins and is recasting itself as a Muslim democratic party in the vein of Germany's Christian Democratic Union. In the November 2019 elections, Ennahda's Prime Minister, Habib Gemli, made it clear that the selection criteria for any cabinet members would be efficiency and integrity and not party or religious affiliation. Another dimension of post-Islamist MENA region is highlighted by the emergence of civil Islam. Contrary to Islamism, which is state-centric and a political ideology, civil Islam focuses on the individual Muslim's spiritual development and the promotion of the general conditions for human society to flourish. So these include religious freedom, human rights, economic development, rule of law, communal harmony, and social justice. Whilst not involved in party political activities, those Muslims subscribing to civil Islam do not endorse adopting a hermit stance to the world. Their participation, however, takes the form of civic activism, from child welfare to educational foundations. Now, there's an inherent danger here on the nature of the civil Islam, since critics might well argue that this is precisely how Islamist organizations have made inroads into local populations with their civic activism. It's always difficult, however, to assess the true intentions of such organizations. Despite the challenges and the hidden dangers on the basis of the tremendous values changes across the MENA region, the demise of political Islam in the long term is occurring. And this might well herald the beginning of a more stable, prosperous, and open polity for the long-suffering inhabitants of this blighted region. Thank you very much.
I wonder if people have questions. I think what we'll do is with the Zoom viewers, we'll take one question at a time, and just repeat the question before you answer it.
This is on. This is a practical question, but I wondered if the surveys that you mentioned at the beginning about the various states, you started out talking about the MENA region and you called it the Middle East. I just wonder if Libya, Algeria, if those populations were surveyed and if the youth in those regions or states were also demonstrating a similar disaffection with the more sort of orthodox version of Islam.
So the question from Dr. Martha Bridgman was about the surveys and if it included certain North African countries and so on. Various surveys said they did, in terms of from Morocco, Libya, Algeria, and so on. But to be frank with you, sometimes I wonder how a survey can be conducted in a place like Libya. Given the fact that you're talking about a war going on, you're talking about a no-go area, and sometimes these surveys is done in terms of urban city dwellers or people who have access to telephones and things like that. So I kind of wonder about Libya. What is interesting in terms of Libya, in my view, I think that the genie is out of the bottle there, both in terms of uh, religious fundamentalism, and you see groups like Islamic State and so on making gains, and more Orthodox Islam coming in. But very importantly, the old divides between the East and West Libya and between the different clan formations is also there. Libya, of course, is also very interesting because, you know, you have all of those migrants going off into Europe and things like that. And indeed, you have literally thousands of clan militias across the region. So even if you talk about Khalifa Haftar's forces and things like that, it's not really true because it's a constellation of different forces around these particular groups. So again, I believe that the surveys would be accurate in a country like Algeria or Morocco in terms of the North African countries, but I'm not quite sure about Libya.
Thank you, Hussein. Thank you. I grew up in Libya until I was 17, so thank you. But my question is not Libya, but about Kurdistan. A century ago, after the First World War, we had the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and the British establishing artificial states in Iraq and so forth, Jordan, Palestine, Israel. That is now coming apart. And my question really is regarding Kurdistan, that straddles Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. It's a lot more tolerant, a lot more multi-religious than most of the other states in the Middle East. What future do you see in Kurdistan? And how do you see a future of a post-British, US oil-dominated system under the dictatorships of various proxies?
Thank you, Terry Crawford Brown, for your question. First, pertaining to Kurdistan. You know, the Kurds have a long and proud history. They have their own language, they have their own customs and so on. And you are right, they've been divided by these artificial states, which came into being literally lines in the desert. Following the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. Let me also say this. I think that you see the Kurds extremely disaffected, and not only oppressed and exploited by their own people, by the respective states, but you also see them being time and again being used in terms of great power rivalries and then being abandoned. I mean, as the Americans recently did. But I think that as these artificial states start collapsing, and it's linked to your next question about the future of those dictatorships in terms of the Middle East. You know, during the American War of Independence against Britain, there was the issue of no taxation without representation. Now, way before COVID-19, you had our switch away from this hydrocarbon economy. And I think that the states which were dependent upon oil and buying the loyalty of the people by giving them benefits, they don't have that capacity. Increasingly now people have to pay VAT, they have to pay taxes and so on. Now comes the question, what about representation? Okay, you can't have 25,000 princes dictating the future of Saudi Arabia. Okay, and especially that there haven't been, I mean, despite Saudi Arabia's vision of a Vision 2030 and diversifying the economy and so on, I think that is a problem. And but the ruling families in the region will have to collectively commit political suicide. I mean, in terms of giving up power, but they will not do that. So I think in the short to medium term, things are going to get messy. Let me say that whilst I am, and it's related to your question about the future of the Middle East, whilst I am generally supportive of the Abrahamic Accords, my problem is that it mustn't give the those leaders who make peace with Israel a free pass in terms of the human rights records. You know, you can't literally saw up a journalist in an Istanbul embassy and then host the G20. You know, it doesn't work that way. And I think that as you switch from hydrocarbons, that leverage will also be minimized. Yeah, I hope that answers your questions.
Please explain to me what's happening in Yemen. What is driving that tragedy? And what is the end? What could the end result be in terms of the Middle East?
Yemen is extremely complicated with your various Sunni and Shia divides, between your various clan divides, made worse by the various foreign forces inside. So you had a president who lost power, who was backed by the Saudis and the UAE, who went in. You had Iran then coming in to support the Houthis, and so on. You know what is interesting about these states, despite the fact that and then just by the way, there were tensions then in terms of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in terms of who they supported, in terms of their particular proxies. I mean, the Saudis thought that they could do this campaign totally by air. And, you know, at the end of the day, you need ground forces to hold the ground, and they didn't do that. What Mohammed bin Salman has done successfully is to create a failed state in Yemen, which Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and various criminal organizations have also used, and you have them attacking. So despite them buying all of this expensive weaponry, they've been unable to deploy it in terms of Yemen. Here's the other flip side of it. It's precisely because of their weakness, which was shown up in terms of Yemen, I think that they have gotten closer to Israel because of the dangers of Iran and the dangers from the Obama administration onwards, trying to pivot to the East and actually leave the Middle East quagmire. And so trying to trap America into the Middle East because of their own weaknesses, frankly. So Yemen is important for all of those reasons. And of course, it is important in terms of Africa because of the support and the networks between Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and your Al-Shabaabs and so on. So it holds implications for us as well.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question from a Zoom viewer, and I just deal with that one.
Yeah.
First, if you would limit the following on from the title of your talk, and having heard you out, you said
the short answer is yes. Sure. So a question from Linda Kumalo was, is there room for democratization in Islam? And my argument is yes, if you move away from this doctrinaire, rigid Islam put forward by the likes of your Islamic State, your Al-Qaeda, or your Muslim Brotherhood, or your Hezbollahs of the world, and if you embrace I wanted to say modernist, as some of the people I quoted, but it's not true, because there's a long tradition in Islamic thought around that. And I explained how if you do not look at Sharia as something static, but as something in terms of the rules by which a government operates, and then the rules dependent upon an individual. So there's siyasa and there's fiqh. So if there is a bottle store down the road from me, as a Muslim, I'm supposed not to touch alcohol. But the point is that it's not the government who should close that bottle store down. Okay, it should be my individual conscience. So if you adopt that position in terms of Sharia law, in terms of the division between siyasa, in terms of the government's position to build roads, or coming from South Africa, how not to be corrupt, then, perhaps then it gives you room to maneuver in terms of creating an Islam which is also attuned to democratic values, and liberal democratic values, might I add.
Just what future for MBS?
So Terry Crawford Brown asked a question about what's future for Mohammed bin Salman. I hope a short one. I think that, also what's been happening is, in terms of under him, you have a state which is allowing women to drive, which is opening up cinemas and so on, and he gets applauded for that. But at the same time, he's hounding his opponents. There is tremendous, his own appointment as crown prince, as you know, was extremely contested within the royal family. I do not want to believe that he represents the future of this democratic Islam that I was alluding to earlier. I would like to see a more open, a more tolerant Islam, but a more democratic polity. And and that will not happen in terms of the centralization of power. And I think he's overplayed his hand, as in Yemen, for example. And I think those contradictions is going to come to haunt him, as the Saudi economy will be unable to diversify, or is unable to in terms of the current circumstances. I think it was in 2008. I was in Saudi Arabia, and at the hotel I was staying, there was a visiting delegation of Singapore, from Singapore, ostensibly advising the government at the time. And I spoke to a member of the delegation, and the delegation suddenly cut their stay short. And I asked the one gentleman from the delegation why. And he said, well, what we said was there needs to be a capable state. So people need to be appointed on the basis of what they know, as opposed to who they know, or their DNA in terms of being 25,000, one of the 25,000 princes. And that was one of the red lines. Saudi Arabia cannot have that if they want to move into the 21st century. Thank you.
Yeah. So the aspiration for the member states for Islam to go the route of liberal democracy. When liberal democracy is doing very badly in our world. And it's in a reversing negative kind of holding in the world, and it's got real competition. So we've seen a lot of recently of the populism. I think populism is not what it was 2 years ago, but the orientation of leaders of Hungary, Poland, to say, we don't want this. And Mr. Putin, of course, says it's dead.
President Trump, who's been stopped in his tracks, was most likely to do great damage to American democracy had he been able to come in for another 4 years. So is it possible that the bus has already left for the MENA states, that liberal democracy is not the coming thing, that it's going to be something else? And of course, in the wings is China with a totally different kind of political message and system, which is attractive to a lot of countries. Now, is that dictatorship? Well, not exactly. Animal. So I'm asking you whether perhaps the focus of your study might have a subsequent book which says, and where will Islam go in a post-liberal democratic system?
So the question from Professor Serensky is about the future of Islam in a post-democratic system. The fact is that Trump did do great damage, I believe, to American democracy and America's image in the world and to issues of multilateralism. Personally, I'm a globalist. Having said that, and I just think this flag waving thing is so 19th century, it's not Bismarck, okay? But Trump did lose. American democracy did triumph. The will of the people was heard. It wasn't, God forbid, ZANU-PF, staying on no matter what. And yes, there is attraction in terms of the Chinese model, because they've been able to deliver to the people. So you have the Communist Party of China, which took, 200 million people out of poverty within the span of a generation, and so on, amazing stuff. But let's also be honest, there are contradictions in terms of this. You can ask the founder of Alibaba about those contradictions. You can look at the ostentatious wealth. You can look at, you have a new political elite and a new economic elite, or rather an economic elite and their relationship with the ruling party and so forth. And yes, there is attraction because there's order and so on. One of the things that I found most interesting, and I'm sorry I did not mention it, about the future of the Middle East, because we were all, I mean, there was this view that, well, what the Arabs, they kind of like their kings and they like their rulers for life and family succession and so forth and so on. And then the Arab Spring hit and we said, wow, we never expected this. And you see this ferment on the streets. Look at the woman mobilizing against Umar al-Bashir in Sudan. And yes, you had the general in Cairo being very popular when he took over from Morsi, but now you have demonstrations against him. Look at Algeria and what's happening. Now, one of the most interesting economists come sociologists, I believe, was an Austrian guy called Eric Wieder. And very much like Barrington Moore and these democratic theorists, he actually spoke about the importance, again, of a middle class. If you want to have democracy to succeed in these particular countries, open the economy up. Open the economy up, allow it to grow, allow an independent middle class to develop with liberal democratic values and alternative power centers to the state and so on. When you look at America, and if you look at Trump, Donald Trump's triumph in 2016 and so forth, I think it had a lot to do, and I hope there's no one here who's a supporter of Reaganomics, but it has a lot to do with Reagan's reforms and how the middle class decreased in size in America since Reagan's years. And the kind of jobs being lost and the state unable to, and I fear something similar, in fact, it's already happening in terms of South Africa, where the state is our economic formula to all of the chaos, even before COVID-19, we were already in recession, is local as lekker, buy local. It's nonsense. So we need to prepare our people for the fourth industrial revolution. We need to prepare our people for a global economy. and increasingly global norms. And that's what we need to do. And in terms of the Middle East, one of the challenges there, of course, is if the economy isn't doing well, then somebody who comes and waves a flag, as in Hungary and Poland, or Trump's America, or indeed Al-Qaeda saying religion is the alternative, the Quran has all of the solutions and so on, well, it's not going to go very well for democracy then. But the key ingredient here is growing economies, and growing the economy also means letting the private sector in. And and then for a classic liberal position maybe, but for a smaller state. I mean, I'm not aware of, and there are business people in the room, but I'm not aware of a single SOE in South Africa which is turning a profit. I mean, frankly, why? I mean, Tito Mboweni said recently, I think this week, well, maybe we should hold some sort of referendum about whether or not we need a national airline. Well, maybe you should have had thought of now that before giving another 10.5 billion rand bailout. And these are the kinds of questions. If you want to help the prospects of democratization and a liberal Islam there, then democracy has to deliver. The social contract has to be there. Issues of representation have to be there. People have to think of themselves as citizens as opposed to Shia and Sunni and Muslim and atheist and Coptic, Christian, and all of that. All of that has to be gone. And they also have to very much accept the fact that you have to allow the private sector in.
Thank you. President, we focused on the Middle East, that region, and you explained to us Islamism and you told us about the difference between Sunni and Shia and how that affects the conflict. However, the biggest, as I understand it, the biggest Muslim society in the world there is, in fact, Indonesia, the country. How does that affect that dynamic?
So the question was about Indonesia, and yeah, Indonesia is the most popular country. They focused on the Middle East. I didn't talk about it, but people like Nocholish, this great Islamic thinker. I think that some of you all may know Rabbi David Rosen. He's doing a seminar now or in Indonesia. And Indonesia has its problems, to be honest. There has been an Islamic State grouping there and so forth. There has been issues of where the government has been pandering to certain Islamist things. But the most interesting thing is that this tolerant Islam, because of the nature of the geography of Indonesia being this large grouping of islands and so on, but also different faiths in terms of specifically in terms of Christianity, but also other faiths, Buddhism and so on. And I think that it has resulted in the state generally being far more moderate and so forth. And they've held the line in certain areas. Unfortunately, certain municipalities have actually played the Islamist cards. So there have been, for example, church burnings and things like that, which have been problematic. But I do believe that there's more reason to be positive about Indonesian Islam, a kind of a syncretic Islam, if you wish, than your more austere Wahhabism or that practiced by the Ayatollahs in Iran.
Thank you. Islamic states harmonize Islam with democracy, without contravening or contradicting Islamic philosophy and
Okay. So the question about Islamic states and issues of democratization, well, as I pointed out in my talk, I actually don't believe in any Islamic states. I don't believe in any Christian states for that matter. I just believe in states. Islamic states, of course, you have Daesh, that Islamic State. But I don't believe that a state should conduct policy on the basis of any faith. That a state does things in terms of national interest. And the point that I was also making about national interest is that increasingly those national interests are intertwined with global interests, and they need to understand global interest and where the state fits in order to improve their citizens' well-being. Thank you.
Any more questions? Oh gosh, we haven't had one from Anna Thompson.
Indeed. The insurgency by the Islamic northern Mozambique.
Sure.
Where do you think that that's being?
Northern Mozambique is extremely complicated for a number of reasons. One, it is on our border. We have porous borders. And if you don't believe me, ask Prophet Bushiri how he got out. But I think there's been, you have an Islamist insurgency, but you also have Mozambique, which actually has Northern Frelimo, which did not look after those people. You have various criminal organizations, specifically drug trafficking, making common cause there. You have arms coming across the border, and it's a mess. And then you have various reports of the Mozambican government deploying its forces, and they were involved in all kinds of extrajudicial killings, which actually people much more. You have a moderate Islam giving way to more radical orthodoxies, because in fact the Muslim population called on the government to assist them because of these Salafist Islamists coming in. And when the government came in, they made no distinction between Salafi Muslims and the local Muslim population. And then, of course, there's the ethnic gap and the fact that much of the population is in the north, which in those areas where, like Cabo Delgado, where there's not much economic development. It's actually made much worse now, also in terms of gas and so on. You had Russian mercenaries, the Wagner Group operating there. You have other private military contractors coming in. And if you want to know what a failed state looks like, you can look at either northern Mozambique or the Cape Flats. Sorry.
The only country you mentioned that I'm aware of is Turkey. And you talked about the green shoots of the democratic attitude of the young, the more approach to globalization. And when I was ambassador in Bulgaria from 2009, we went immediately to Turkey, and Ataturk's secular state was still, to some extent, present. The people we met were for it. They were anti-Erdogan and Gül and so on. Now, for instance, Christian shrines like the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, but we saw this happening already in 2013. There's quite a well-known Hagia Sophia on the northern coast of Turkey, on a famous peninsula. That has already in 2013 been on the orders of Erdogan, hung with all the Christian images with Hessian stacks coming in front of them. And now, 6 years later, they attacked and de-Christianized the Hagia Sophia, a famous iconic shrine for Christians. I can't put these two together. All these young people who want to democratize, they seem to get their way. And can you just comment on this, somehow this disconnect?
Turkey was and has been a fascinating country because of its history, the Ottomans and so on. And I think that when the AKP first came in, this talk that Islam can be finally married with democracy and capitalism. You remember all the positive things, President George Bush visiting there and making that statement as well. Erdogan was feted and so on. But in retrospect, I think he played his cards very carefully. He was also, in terms of the Kurds, negotiating with the Kurds, with the and so forth. But I think that he was fearful because in the past, Islamists were overthrown by the military, going back to Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, in terms of the military being the bastion of secular values. And once, how many generals and admirals, leave alone journalists, are sitting in Turkish prisons. And once he neutralized the Turkish military, his true Islamist colors and his own despotic views, someone described him as neo-Ottoman, with neo-Ottoman ambitions, came into play. Whether it's Nagorno-Karabakh, whether it's his involvement in North Africa, in terms of Libya, in terms of Sudan, and so forth, or indeed in terms of Israel-Palestine, and so on. Unfortunately, when you look at Hagia Sophia, and I actually wrote a piece, I believe it came out in the Daily Maverick earlier this year, there is Islamic precedent when the Caliph went into Jerusalem to have the patriarch of Sophronius to surrender, and he didn't enter the church and so on because he didn't want Muslims to come and worship. They expected. So if you were truly operating within the parameters of the so-called Rashidun, the first four rightly guided caliphs in terms of Islamic tradition, then Erdogan wouldn't. But I think that he's using that because of the own unhappiness within his own rule. He isolated people like Gül and so on, if you look at the Turkish lira, it's a disaster. The economy is in disaster. His family has been implicated in terms of corruption and so on, and not a good month of unhappiness. Many of the youth of his own party, in the survey that I quoted, actually, they want to immigrate to Switzerland, not Saudi Arabia.
Please bear with our viewers. They're just trying to reconnect. I'm afraid we have to end this meeting. We cannot reconnect to the Mountain Club. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.